Neoliberalism, a word you hear when people talk about the housing crisis, privatisation, the outsourcing of our health service, or the spread of precarious jobs. Things were different in the 1960s. We had full employment. They built public housing. There was a boom from the 1940s to the 1960s, and it seemed as if the capitalist system had overcome its tendency to crisis. But under the surface, crisis was about to reassert itself, and this would produce a new ideology which justified an attack on workers. Neoliberalism sounds abstract, but it represents a very real and cruel reality for a lot of people. We've seen cuts to welfare and wages over the austerity years, the outsourcing of health services, the lack of provision of social housing, growing inequality, the funneling of funds to tax havens, the accumulation of massive debts on a global scale. The market is God is the mantra of today, but it wasn't always the case. Moderates, like the economist Keynes, had advocated state spending as a way to offset economic crisis. In reality, Keynes never imagined how his ideas would eventually be implemented. It was massive war spending in the 1930s that led to a boom. After World War II, the capitalist system doubled in size. Even Ireland had full employment by the late 1960s. Workers' confidence rose and there was a wave of strikes, but everything changed in 1973. A worldwide economic crisis began, which at first seemed like it was an oil crisis, but underneath, the very heart of the capitalist system had been weakened. Profit rates had been falling right throughout the 60s and had now collapsed. Governments threw out Keynesian ideas about state spending. You see, when profits were strong, buying social peace with the working class by spending on welfare and healthcare was fine. But when profits came under pressure, the ruling class needed to go on the attack. And to justify this assault on the working class, they needed an ideology that justified the assault. In from the margins came Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman. These market extremists hadn't been popular during the boom years, but now that economic crisis was spreading across the capitalist system, they suddenly became very, very popular. They advocated a return to dog-eat-dog, unregulated capitalism of the pre-boom era. This doctrine seemed to offer a way out for the desperate ruling class facing pressure on their profits. The doctrine was first called monetarism, or in the 1980s, Thatcherism, or in the USA, Reaganism. This ruling class market ideology helped them to sanctify their own rule, to justify their attack on workers, and to give them confidence and coherence in this attack. But it's important to distinguish neoliberal theory from the actual practice, what they say about what they do from what they actually do. One of the tenets of neoliberal theory is to do away with state spending. In reality, the state spends more on the capitalists but less on workers. US state spending as a percentage of GNP rose throughout the entire 20th century, including during the years of economic crisis in the 70s, 80s and 90s. The US state spends over $500 billion a year on arms. The neoliberal ruling class use the state to take what they need economically, to take what they need politically, but also to use military force when it comes to it. Look at the amount of privatization and theft of resources that occurred in Iraq after the US invasion. This was neoliberalism, but neoliberalism wasn't about the operation of blind market forces. Those blind market forces came with US soldiers armed with machine guns and in tanks. The neoliberals also used the state to attack the working class. For example, Thatcher took on the miners in Britain and used the state police force to do so. This was at its most extreme in 1973 in Chile. General Pinochet overthrew the left-wing government of Salvador Allende. Pinochet massacred thousands of workers, herded people into football stadiums. The Chicago Boys, as Milton Friedman's neoliberal crew were known, flew in to advise the new right-wing dictatorship. While left-wingers and working-class people were tortured and abused, the Chicago Boys dismantled public spending, destroyed the public sphere, auctioned off most of the state enterprises, deindustrialized Chile. Unemployment increased tenfold. Massive shanty towns grew. The country fell into a deep recession in the 1980s, with huge soup lines, but huge wealth accumulated in the coffers of General Pinochet and his friends. Here in Ireland, we saw the state step in to bail out the bankers, costing the taxpayer $64 billion. The ruling class will use the state as long as it transfers wealth from us to them. The ruling class also used the state to implement privatisation. In the 1980s, privatisation was a pragmatic response on behalf of the ruling class to the fiscal crisis of the state. It also helped the ruling class as a whole restore profitability by pushing down wages. Workers in state enterprises, when they were privatised, were pushed harder and faced lower wages. Privatisation aided the class power of the ruling class, not only through this wealth transfer, but also if industries, hospitals and housing provision were farmed off to private companies, the state could say it was none of their responsibility. The political wing of the ruling class and the politicians could blame impersonal market forces for a housing crisis or a health crisis, and in that way impose their class rule. Can we beat neoliberalism? Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, provides a useful explanation of how the capitalists will use a catastrophe to implement more neoliberal policies. For example, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, they privatised some of the schools in New Orleans. The Irish Health Service is another example of where a crisis leads to a new government plan. The new plan implements more neoliberalism, more privatisation, which leads to further deaths and more crisis. But where Naomi Klein's book is weak is in not pointing to the weakness of neoliberalism. Financial capital is still tied to industrial capital. They still need buildings, machines, IBM chip production plants. Even IT workers need computers, office blocks and investment, which the capitalists will not quickly abandon. Building up an army of trained workers with an appropriate skills base is not something that corporations can just dispose of. And even where that workforce are on precarious contracts, precarious work, while growing, still does not represent the majority of work. And where it exists, workers can and have fought back. For example, fast food workers who have organised despite anti-union policies by the fast food companies. The capitalists like to exaggerate the perils of precarious work in order to beat down workers. But as Jim Larkin and James Connolly showed back during the lockout years, if workers organise, they can fight back against any situation. There is no alternative was Margaret Thatcher's mantra. We have to believe that there is an alternative to neoliberalism. The water movement here in Ireland shows that people power can push back establishment politicians and the neoliberal assault.